Let's talk about adding and subtracting unlike fractions. We learned the other day that like fractions are those fractions who have the same denominator. So unlike fractions are the opposite. It is those fractions with different denominators. In order to add unlike fractions, it says you need to rename the fractions with a common denominator. So we have to turn them into like fractions in order to add and subtract them. So let's take a look at some examples. Again, it says unlike fractions are fractions with different denominators. Use the least common multiple of the denominators to rename the fractions before adding them. Well, there are three different ways that we can rename fractions with a common denominator, and it depends on the situation and the denominators that we have that determines how we are going to rename them. And I'm going to show you an example of each of those three. For example, example 1, it says find 3/5 plus 1/3 and write it in simplest form. Well, 3/5 and 1/3 do not have the same denominator. So we're going to have to change those so that they have the least common denominator. In order to do that, I'm going to ask myself some questions. The first question I'm going to ask is, will the smaller denominator divide equally into the larger denominator? So will 3 divide into 5? The answer to that question is no, it won't. So I have to go on to my second question. The second question is, do my denominators have a common factor? Is there a number that divides equally into both of them? Well, 5 and 3 are both prime numbers, so the answer to that is, other than 1, no. There is not a number that divides equally into 5 and 3. So if that is the case, then the only way I can get the least common denominator is to take my two denominators and multiply them together. So my common denominator in this problem is going to be 15. Like before, we want to write our fractions up and down. So we're going to put 3/5 and 1/3 up and down. They are both positive, so I know I'm going to add them. I'm going to make them with the common denominator by multiplying 3/5 by 3/3 and 1/3 by 5/5. That's because 5 times 3 equals 15, our common denominator. And whatever I do to the bottom of my fraction, I must also do to the top. So 3 times 3 equals 9. On my bottom fraction here, 3 times 5 on the bottom equals 15, my common denominator. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. And 1 times 5 is 5. So I end up with 9/15 plus 5/15, two like fractions. I add the numerators, 9 plus 5 equals 14, and I keep the denominator, 15. So the answer to 3/5 plus 1/3 is 14/15. Make sure, if you can, simplify and do not leave any fractions as improper. As I said, I'm going to show you examples of all three different ways of getting a common denominator. So let's go down here and take a look at example 1a. Example 1a says 1/6 plus 3/4. I'm going to ask my two questions. Question number 1, does the smaller denominator divide into the larger denominator? Well, 4 does not divide equally into 6. So the answer to that question is no. So the second question I'm going to ask is there a number that divides equally into both 4 and 6? And that answer is yes. When you have that situation, what you should do is take both of your denominators, put them next to each other, and make this upside down division bar. The number that divides equally into both 6 and 4 is 2. I'm going to write that outside, and then I'm going to divide both of those numbers. 2 divided by 6 is 3, and 2 divided by 4 is 2. And I'm going to ask myself, Is there a number that divides equally into 3 and 2 other than 1? The answer is no. So I will not divide anymore. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all 3 of those numbers and I'm going to multiply them together. 2 times 3 is 6, times 2 is 12. 12 is going to be my least common denominator. So I will rewrite my problem as 1 over 6 plus 3 over 4. Knowing that my common denominator is 12, I will have to multiply 1/6 by 2 over 2 and 3/4 by 3 over 3. That's going to give me 2/12 as my top fraction plus 9/12 as my bottom fraction. Now that they are like fractions, I can add, and 2 plus 9 equals 11, and the denominator stays the same. I check to see if I can simplify, which I cannot, and I have a proper fraction. So my answer is 1/6 plus 3/4 equals 11/12. So again, if you have a number that can divide equally into both of your denominators, that's what you're going to do. You're going to divide that number into both denominators, get their answers. So 2 goes into 6 3 times, 2 goes into 4 2 times, and then you're going to multiply the number you divided by times the 2 answers that you got to get your common denominator. We're going to call that the least common denominator. Okay, so that's 2 different ways. Way number 1 was, okay, there was no common factor and the smaller one didn't divide into the larger one, so we multiplied our denominators together. Second way was we had a common factor that went into 6 and 4, so we found the least common denominator using that method. Well, look at 1b. On 1b, we have 2/7 plus 3/14. The easiest way to find a common denominator is if the smaller denominator divides equally into the larger one. Well, 7 does go into 14. It goes in twice. So 14 is actually going to be our common denominator. So I will rewrite the problem with 2/7 plus 3/14. And since my common denominator is 14, I'm going to multiply 2/7 by 2 over 2 to get 4/14. And all I have to do is drag over the 3/14 because it already has that common denominator. Now I can just add 4 plus 3 and get 7, and I could put that back over 14. And as I said before, we need to make sure that we simplify all of our fractions. 7 and 14 are both divisible by 7, so I end up with 1/2 as my answer. So 2/7 plus 3/14 equals 1/2. That leaves you to try 1C and 1D on your own.